Good evening, everybody. So I was in conversation with a friend about life. We are both facing some challenges in life. And somewhere in the conversation I said, sometimes life does not offer us choices. Life does not offer us choices. And perhaps you've experienced this. Those who get diagnosed with terminal illness, when we lose a loved one, or an accident changes the course of our lives, life does not offer us too many choices. All we can do is face the reality and pray for grace and strength. The Transfiguration was a powerful, awe-filled, and life-transforming event for the disciples. But was the Transfiguration one of those events where life did or did not offer a choice to the disciples? The reason I ask this question is, after having seen the glory, could they say no? But to say yes, they would have to go down the mountain and embrace suffering. So I don't know about the choice they had. What did the Transfiguration of Jesus mean for Peter, James, and John? What does the Transfiguration mean for us? So I have 3 points today, and in my first 2 points, I would like to do an exegesis, which is looking at the text a little more deeply. An exegesis of the Transfiguration narrative by Matthew. And then in my third point, I want to draw some practical implications for us. So here's my first point. I want to talk about the timeline of the Transfiguration, or the chronology of the Transfiguration. So Matthew opens his composition of, or his Transfiguration narrative with these words. He says, after 6 days. Matthew was being intentional when he provided this timeline. There is an allusion here to God's revelation on Mount Sinai, where a cloud covered the mountain for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, God called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. So that's the Old Testament context that Matthew is giving. In real life, though, in the real life of Jesus, there is another timeline. The Transfiguration happens as Jesus and his disciples were making their way up to Jerusalem. The journey to Jerusalem meant that Jesus' life and ministry were heading towards the climax, the resurrection. But to get to the resurrection, he would have to go down the mountain, take up the cross, endure suffering and death. Now, the timeline that Matthew provides is significant both from Jesus' perspective and the perspective of the disciples. From Jesus' perspective, just before his death, he's about to die, he was being revealed, like God, to Moses on Mount Sinai, as a continuation of God's saving work along with Moses and Elijah. The voice from the cloud, just like the cloud on Mount Sinai, the voice from the cloud on Mount Sinai, this voice said, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." So that's from Jesus' perspective. From the disciples' perspective, they will have to continue the journey to Jerusalem with Jesus. You see, they've come thus far. Now that they know, should they go forward or not? But here's the thing. Their timeline would have to merge with Jesus' timeline. They must listen to him. But listening to him did not just mean building a tent and staying on top of the mountain. That sounded so good. It meant rather the disciples must go down the mountain. Listening meant the disciples going down the mountain with Jesus and literally follow him as he embraced his suffering and death. So here and now for the disciples, here and now, in this time and moment, the disciples found themselves in the midst of a very life-transforming experience like it happens to us. Here and now, in this time and moment, life presented to the disciples a choice or not. So secondly, I want to talk about the nature of the Transfiguration. How do we understand the Transfiguration? What kind of an event is this? Now that we have understood the timeline, let us understand the nature. In chapter 17, verse 19, which concludes the Transfiguration narrative, Matthew calls it a vision. But scripture scholars call it an apocalyptic vision. Apocalyptic visions are unlike just normal visions, like, for example, you have in Fatima. Apocalyptic visions are connected to persecutions, to suffering and death. An apocalyptic vision gives the suffering visionaries a glimpse into their future glory. This is very important because suffering is happening in the present. They get a glimpse into their future glory. Now, this is clear in today's first reading from Daniel. During a time of persecution, Daniel is granted an apocalyptic vision of what goes on in the heavens and what will happen in the future. So, I think the Transfiguration is best understood not just as a vision, but as an apocalyptic vision. At the Transfiguration, the disciples, just like Daniel, are given a vision into who Jesus really is. This is my beloved Son. And what he will be in God's kingdom in the future. It was important that the disciples have an insight into Jesus' identity and his future destiny because soon Jesus would be persecuted. He would go down the mountain and embrace his fate. And when this happens, the disciples must remember who Jesus is and the future glory that awaits him. They must remember Moses and Elijah and the voice that said, "This is my beloved Son." So understanding the Transfiguration as an apocalyptic vision balances Jesus' imminent persecution, suffering, and death with the glory that awaits him. Finally, the implications of the Transfiguration. What does this mean for us? First, as an apocalyptic vision, the Transfiguration confirmed for Jesus and the disciples Jesus' identity and the future glory that awaited him. Knowing his identity and the future glory, we see Jesus going down the mountain and embracing human life in its totality. For me, gosh, I can't tell you how important this is for me, that Jesus embraced the totality of human life. Sufferings and questions and challenges and crisis and all. He embraces it all. He does not run away from life. Jesus does not run away from life. Rather, he embraces it in obedience to God's will and for human redemption. So, for us too, life is a complex and complicated reality. I don't know about you, but I'll tell you what. Sometimes you ask yourself, what in the world is going on? Life is complex and complicated. Sometimes life offers us choices and sometimes it does not. And as we face life like Jesus, you need to know who you are. And we know that we are God's beloved sons and daughters. And we know our future glory. We know our destiny. Knowing who we are and the glory that awaits us, we too embrace life like Jesus did. Sufferings and questions and challenges and crisis and all. We don't run away from life, but embrace it in its complexity. And secondly, we remember from the timeline, the chronology of the events, that the Transfiguration happened as Jesus and his disciples made their way to Jerusalem. The timeline revealed to the disciples that they would have to merge their timeline with God's timeline. And often I have found myself in the same place as the disciples. Often, life does put us on crossroads. In these times, the best place to find ourselves is on the top of the mountain. So today I want to propose that it is the Eucharist, where Jesus and our life comes together. I'm telling you, there is no other place like this. This is where Jesus and our life comes together. Here is our mountain of transfiguration. Each Sunday is our transfiguration day. Here we bring life. Remember how afraid the disciples were on the mountain? Here we bring life and our fears, and we face it with Jesus. Here, our life mingles with the life of God. Here, our timeline merges with the timeline of Jesus. Here we enter into communion, God with us and we with God. And then we go down the mountain, back to our homes today, back to work tomorrow. We go back down the mountain and we face life for another week till we come back again to do this all over again. We do this while on earth until one day our lives will become totally one with God. And then we will share that future glory that has been promised to us. So let me end with where I began. Life may not offer us choices, but God makes a choice to show us the face of Jesus. Life may not offer us choices, but we do have the choice to let our life become one with God's, and God's life become one with ours. People of God said,